Although living brains are pretty complex, this week we've used metaphor and analogy and zombies to help simplify matters. In essence, people have two fundamentally different modes of thinking that, for the purposes of this course, we've labeled focused and diffuse. We used a simple pinball analogy to help us understand the differences between the modes. The focused mode has tight spacing for the rubber bumpers, which seems to, in some sense, help keep your thoughts concentrated. The diffuse mode, on the other hand, has more widely spaced bumpers that allow for more broad-ranging ways of thinking. The focused mode is centered more in the prefrontal cortex, and it often seems to involve thinking about things you're somewhat familiar with. For example, if you're familiar with multiplication and you're trying to solve a multiplication problem, or you're trying to find a word that rhymes with another word, you're probably stepping along the somewhat familiar pathways of the focused mode. But if you're trying to solve or figure out something new, it often cries out for the more broad-ranging perspectives of the diffuse mode. This mode, as it turns out, is representative of the brain's many neural resting states. Creative thinkers throughout history, whatever their discipline, have found ways to access the diffuse mode, often more directly and quickly. But we all access this mode quite naturally when we do things like go for a walk or take a shower or even just drift off to sleep. When we find ourselves stuck on a problem, or even if we're unsure of a situation in the course of living our daily life, it's often a good idea, once you've focused directly on the situation, to let things settle back and take a bit more time. That way, more neural processing can take place, often below conscious awareness in the diffuse mode. The thing is, it often takes time for neural processing to take place, and time as well to build the new neural structures that allow us to learn something new. This is why tackling procrastination is so very important. The easiest way to tackle procrastination is to use the Pomodoro technique, that brief 25-minute stretch of focused concentration followed by a bit of mental relaxation. It's through practice and repetition that we can help enhance and strengthen the neural structures we're building as we're learning something new. Practice and repetition is particularly important for more abstract topics. Memory, of course, is an important aspect of learning. There are 4 slots in our working memory. Things can fall out of those slots unless we keep repeating them to hold them in mind. In that sense, working memory is like a not very good blackboard. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is like a storage warehouse. If you've practiced and repeated something well enough to get it into long-term memory, you can usually call it up later if you need it, although you may need an occasional bit of repetition to freshen the memory up. It's never a good idea to cram your learning by repeating things many times all in one day, because that's like trying to build muscle by lifting weights all in one day. There's no time for solid structures to grow. We've also learned of the importance of sleep in washing away the toxins that develop during our day's activities. You want to avoid taking tests or doing anything difficult with little sleep the night before, because it's like trying to think with poison on the brain. And just as importantly, exercise is surprisingly valuable in helping improve both our memory and our ability to learn. We've had a lot of fun while learning this week. I'll bet you'll find next week's material to be even more exciting. I'm Barbara Oakley. Thanks for learning how to learn.
Hi, I'm Mary Ann, one of the TAs for the Learning How to Learn course. The first module is almost over, and I would like to take a minute to encourage you. I can tell you from my own experience, this course has changed how I study and learn. Before this course, I would study hard, but no matter how much I studied, I couldn't retain what I learned. Honestly, I thought there was something wrong with me. Then I took this course and I found out it was the way I was learning or thought I was learning. That was the problem. All these years of schooling, including an undergraduate degree and a master's degree, and I never had one instructor show me what the instructors in this course share with us. Using the techniques I learned in this course, I now know how to retain the information I want to learn. Participants in other courses sometimes drop the first week, but don't do that in this course. You will lose out on an opportunity of a lifetime. Knowing how we can learn effectively is a life skill everyone needs, no matter where we are in life. It's never too late. If you see me in the discussion forum, say hello. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can help each other learn how to learn. To hear your thoughts on how we can help each other learn how to learn.
It's quite common to get stuck on a problem, but often you have initial idea about what the solution should be. That not really see the real solution. We got the following are good next best step to take when you already spend time in realizing the problem by focusing intently, and you find that you are simply stuck. Check all that's apply. Switch attention to something completely different. It doesn't matter. Go for it or take a shower, anything, allow your mind to relax and drive randomly around. Drive randomly. Keep walking away at the horizon and keep going. It's worth anything every time before you so let's just do it correctly come to the sense after you have become expert that you need you should. Or if a lot is someone is star and turn, you should have to take break on this process. Tell his friend about the technique and then stop using it and as you master it. Everything is in my spreads with over tomato sauce and you are now studying small and more processes in the back than any great individual. It's a small brain like random connection in relations relations fashion. Selected for introspection regarding procrastination. It seems to involve in the time to switch the mental attention away from something you find slightly painful. When you feel naturally discomfort with something, you go on to switch your attention to something or something can help you to it. The first thing is going to take to tackle procrastination focuses your rage problem. One of the various qualities when the focus mode and diffuse according to this period. So focus mode is favors with the concept focus mode only. By concept and problem solving technique that at least somewhat familiar to you, the previous knowledge lay you sharp and wide and pathway. You tend to relax, daydream like practical solving. Wave Dory upside down and focus on details as well as really skirt on detail. As far as the first video describes the films with focus on different currency. Selective range of stagement mostly according to this movie. Two liters sleep over too long is time associated with a sharp nasal condition, including headaches, depression, heart disease, disabling enters, and brain failure. During sleep, your brain uses a less important part of memory and stimulation levels. As a request on the theory, you should get at least 12 hours every 24 hours. Sleep is designed to allow for synonymous clear assurance with big sunlight. If you go over what you are learning right, differences and Cambridge. To brand new velocities. Some devices are not allowed it. Still third person.
Snore.
Snore. Snores. Sinus.
Sinus.
Sinus. Space in body. Space in body.
Sinus.
Any space inside the head but connected to the back of the nose. Sinus.
Sinus.
Sleep inside the long snoring via silence. Selected for introspection about memory in accordance with information is so that if you try to do something in terms of memory, it is subjective. Time in one event, for example, it occurs greater than equal to same of no, it's not true. You do not leave time for the motor to drive. Time plus synaptic connection to form extension. You won't have a very good memory structure. Yes. Working memory is like a large store warehouse. Your working memory is like in effective mental board. Carrying the whole fusion in mind and looking at it for out. Yes, it's true. So like explain interesting to the practice according to small view. Practice is very important to attract ideas is very much rather no. Practice in general isn't that important along with understand the story. Neuron become alive together to use more attractively is more important is it to practice in order to bring these ideas into reality for you. Practice have make memory more permanent. Check active below this with more depth to route, diffuse rather than focus mode. Working a familiar type with deep citation problem. Take a shower, and some promises are in your concerning to be practical. What? This exercise is unrelated to learning. What generally inhibits learning and is pattern of the major learning activity inhibit inhibit
inhibit,
inhibit slow down process or grow something. The strong inhibit to grow it. The strong inhibit allow you to disconnect from what you have recorded. This allows you right to kick in. As strongly and creative effort where you slightly beyond changing. In math and science, it's something to identify and loss real concept point to attract nature of a closing point. For example, it's like word cloud. You invert an end where you can direct point to. Math and science often involve more abstract rather than a trade idea. Math and science generally involve concrete abstract. Math is also regular emotional you can feel. Um, According to reals, what happened in your brain during sleep that help you remember new experience? And like to sleep, the exhaustion, the brain forms new synapse. The brain speaks off like a lighthouse. So like the true stage of the human brain. Other brain can form new synapse. Sleep happens. One brain connect is that it can change. Brain connect is very the channels there is connectivity is dynamic. Uh,
regarding,
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 regarding. This commonly is being question regarding about, regarding. This raises this word between nation according to what's right if involved. No, we didn't talk about this. Actually, it's worth the time to make the decision is a price for a nearby with injuring the right side of the brain. It's recommended attempting to see things more clearly, realizes in preconception by drawing them upside down. Okay, but it is everything is worse. I don't write this person. We invert time it with copy. This will be often issued with actively with notification. Notification. 4. Exercise can be done at any time overall. Survival enhancements and learning program. Generate learning. Mm-hmm.
When Benny Lewis turned 21, the only language he spoke was English. Actually, he'd done quite poorly with languages in school. Truth be told, he initially had problems even with English and had to go to speech therapy when he was young because of it. So Benny's not naturally gifted with languages. He has a degree in electronic engineering. So where I went from language to engineering, Benny went the other way around. Benny's love affair with other cultures and speaking foreign languages began in 2003 after graduation from the university when he moved to Spain. He discovered that learning languages wasn't so hard when you apply the right method. In his current career as a full-time language hacker over the last dozen years, he's discovered people from all around the world who have learned to stop making excuses about why they can't learn a language and have instead learned how to learn a new language. I've read Benny's book, which is the best book on language learning I've ever read. His advice is absolutely brilliant. If you think you don't have the language gene, or you're too old, don't have time, or are just too shy to try, Benny's book will help you get past these hurdles. So it's a pleasure to welcome here Benny Lewis. Benny, your life is always filled with so many adventures. So tell me, what is your latest adventure?
My latest adventure is that this year I am trying to make America multilingual and other countries multilingual that generally only speak English. And I am currently about 1,000 or 2,000 miles into my 7,000 mile road trip across America. I did the whole West Coast, the Northeast, and I'm going to every single state, and I'm trying to encourage people to learn languages.
Wow, what an endeavor, and what an important endeavor. You talk about people sometimes wanting to learn languages for the wrong reasons. What are those wrong reasons, and what have you discovered is a more motivating factor for learning languages?
Right, well, there are quite a lot of wrong reasons. The worst of all is to show off. If you think that I will learn this language so people will think I'm smart, or people will like me more, or I'll be able to pick up girls, or anything along those lines, then it's not going to work, because I found that what you really do need is a passion for that language, for the culture. You want to really speak that language inherently for the reasons of how fascinating that language is. And that's going to motivate you just to speak it. If you have other things, like you just want to get an A in an exam or a B just so you can get into university, then that's not a very good motivator, because you are not actually interested in using that language. So I highly recommend people try to embrace the culture, try to spend time speaking with other human beings, and then you'll get the motivation that's going to help you to skyrocket your progress.
I like that approach. You've talked about how children have one big advantage. Can you tell us what that advantage is?
Sure. So I think that the fact that children are not so much perfectionists like adults tend to be, children are okay with making mistakes. They kind of stumble and fall, and we help them along, and they play games in the language and they live the language. Whereas in language learning, adults tend to study dusty old grammar books. They tend to be so afraid of making mistakes that they won't speak at all. And this is a huge mistake, because in language learning, it's not like we visualize it in an academic setting, where every mistake you make gives you a red X, and if you make enough, you get an F. That's not the real world. In the real world, you can make lots of mistakes, but people will still understand you. If I have just started to learn a language, you may think I should wait until I say, "Excuse me, kind sir, could you direct me to the nearest bathroom, please?" Or I could just say, "Bathroom where?" And people understand that. That's not a perfectly formed sentence, but you have to be a good beginner learner, and a good beginner learner knows to make a few mistakes or a lot of mistakes to get their point across. And I find children, their main advantage is that they're okay with just saying something, and they're not going to overanalyze everything that comes out of their mouth. The good news is This is not an inherent advantage that is built into them and not built into us. It's just kind of the way children act, and we can learn from that. We can learn to try to have some fun with our language, laugh at the fact that we're making mistakes, and realize people are a lot nicer than you think, and they're going to be very patient with you.
I think that's an important point is, well, of course, just being willing to make mistakes, making those mistakes, and then realizing that most people are actually pretty friendly and accommodating as you're learning and adjusting and getting situated. One thing that you've talked about that I think is a really important point is the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, for myself, for instance, I got into language learning as an adult, but I failed at 5 years learning German in school. I barely passed my exams after 10 or 11 years learning Irish or Gaelic. And I lived in Spain for 6 months, and I did not pick up any Spanish. And I really genuinely feel that the reason this happened was because of a series of self-fulfilling prophecies. When I was in Spain and 21 years old, I told myself, you know, I'm too old to learn a language now. I passed this cutoff age of 14. And the thing is, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because I believed this was true. So I thought, okay, well, there's no point in doing any work now. So I only put like minimal effort in. And because of that, I don't make any progress. And then I look at that lack of progress and I'm like, you see, this just goes to prove that adults are not good language learners. And it makes no sense when you actually look at it that way. And it was the same in school. In school, I initially didn't do so well in my exams, and I was thinking, oh, I can't do so well in these exams, so I guess there's no point in really studying. And then, of course, I did worse in my exams, and it was just a constant feedback loop. And like, there's a quote from Henry Ford that I like relevant to this. He says, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. And I think that's the case with self-fulfilling prophecies. People need to put these excuses aside that I don't have any time, you make the time. I'm too old, you're not too old. There are so many ways you can realize that none of these are real issues, that the actual reason you haven't learned the language is your devotion to these reasons.
You say that successful language learners learn despite the challenges. What do you mean by that?
So people have this idealized vision, you know, the grass is always greener on the other side. They see someone who successfully learned the language and they think to themselves, this person has had it easy. They must have had rich parents who paid for tuition their whole life. They must have just been blessed to have had the right DNA to give them the language learning gene. They must have had it so easy and just stumbled across native speakers and had a perfect situation. This is simply not the case. This is what we like to tell ourselves once again in our self-fulfilling prophecies. I don't have the ideal situation. I don't have good luck in all of this, and the other person does. And in talking to a lot of language learners, I have found each one of them have their own challenges to go through. There are some really well-known language learners on YouTube who are very impressive in their language skills, but they're family people. They have a family to raise. They may be working 1 or 2 jobs. You know, it's not like they laze around with millions of dollars and just spend all day long learning languages. They have their own challenges. And I even came across a very inspirational story of a lady who's partially deaf and clinically blind at the same time, and she still managed to learn 5 languages. So this shows me that no matter what the setbacks people have, they find a way around them. And you know, and you can say, oh, that guy has it easy because he can travel and I can't. But then find a way to learn a language despite not traveling. There are actually great ways to get immersion virtually. You can get Skype-based conversational practice. You can listen to streamed radio 24 hours a day if you wanted. You could create a virtual immersion environment. But any one of these things are issues that other people may have. You may have advantages that other successful language learners may not have had. You may be able to afford a private teacher. You may have spare time on your weekends when someone else works 2 jobs or has a family to support and has less time flexibility. So every single person in the world has had challenges to go through, and it's just unrealistic to think, woe is me, I have this unfortunate situation no one else can understand. I guarantee you, no matter what your problem is, a successful language learner has had that, and if not more problems, and still managed to overcome them.
People sometimes have a history of failure when they've tried to learn new languages. What do you say to someone who's failed when they're learning a new language, and have you ever felt like giving up in your language studies?
I felt like giving up millions of times, even in my more experienced stages in learning a language. And the thing is, it's like I said before, nobody has it super duper easy, including successful and experienced language learners. So at the very start, for instance, when I tried to learn Spanish, I tested out a lot of things that were huge failures. I spent 6 months trying to learn Spanish, and I got nowhere in that time. One of the things I did was I bought El Señor de los Anillos, which is the Lord of the Rings, and I thought if I just went through this book page by page with the dictionary, then after I reached page 700, I'd be fluent in Spanish. I had this like ridiculous idea, and it took me a whole week to get to page 2. So when I was at page 2, I was thinking to myself, it's going to take me a decade to read this book at this rate. And I was thinking, I'm just an idiot. I'm not destined to learn Spanish or any other language. And even like more recently, a couple of years ago, I was learning Mandarin, and I didn't find the Mandarin language itself to be so complicated. It's actually a lot more straightforward than you may think. But I was learning it in the country, which I actually do not recommend to people. I recommend you learn the language in advance via the internet, so that when you're in the country, you can experience the culture. I think it's kind of a bit of a waste to be in the country to be in study mode when you should be out enjoying it. But at the time, I was not doing that, and I found it very difficult to adjust to the cultural side of things, and that slowed me down dramatically in the language side of things. So no matter how experienced someone is, they're going to run into problems, they're going to get slowed down, and it's like anything. If at first you don't succeed, try again. And like a lot of people in language learning would reach a plateau as well. They may make a bit of progress and get stuck, and then they think, I'm broken, I'm not a good language learner. And I found that it's the exact opposite. People need to try different techniques. So my suggestion is that people get into speaking the language immediately. I give tips for people to speak from the very first day. And that may work for you, it may not work for you, but you try something out. And if you still say, after trying this out for a few weeks, I'm still not making any progress at all, then that doesn't mean you're not a good language learner. It means you're using a system that is not good for you. If you're studying a lot and you're not making progress, you may need to abandon a study-based approach and try to interact with the language a lot more. So that's what I'd suggest.
I love these ideas and these approaches. I know they were very helpful for me with Russian. In this course, one of the things we talk about is the importance of pushing your attention very hard, for example, when you're using something like the Pomodoro technique, and then relaxing. You talk about something like that with your mini-mission brain melting technique. Could you tell us a little about that?
Right. Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of the Pomodoro technique as well. I've used that a lot during my intensive study days. So I definitely agree with that. I've tried to study all day, it doesn't work. You need little breaks. But then that also applies over the longer term. So when I was learning some languages intensely over a couple of months, then that's all my focus. I've given up TV, I've given up going to the cinema, going out and so on. And I find I reach a certain point where my brain just feels saturated and I can't really take in anymore. And it's unfortunate, but I try to study and it just goes in one ear out the other. So I applied this to the kind of medium term scale. And what I would do is I would study, like if I'm in an intensive learning period, so this is not people who are studying an hour a week, but people who are studying like 3 or 4 or more hours a day, so you're putting every spare second you have into it, then I would be working hard for 5 or 6 days a week, and then I would take 1 day off. And I would just repeat that process, because if you do it consistently for too long, you may overexert yourself. So I find that I kind of apply this Pomodoro technique in over several days, and then even bigger than that, I would repeat this process for 4 weeks, and then at the end, once a month, I would take the whole weekend off. So it's weird. You would think, I just have to study intensively. And once again, this is not something necessarily true for everybody, but I found that my limit is about 6 days of consistent study, and I need a little break, and then 3 or 4 weeks of consistent study, and I need a proper longer break.
Well, boring into some of the specific details of how you learn, you mentioned that rote rehearsal, just repeating a word over and over again, for example, is not a good way to remember it. What's a better way?
It's not a good way to remember it, but it kind of works a little bit. I mean, repetition is part of learning any language, but the catch is I see rote repetition as very asymmetrical. So, for instance, when I was learning German, then I saw that the word for table is Tisch. So I just said to myself, Tisch, table, Tisch, table, Tisch, table, Tisch, table, whatever it was, 100 times or 1,000 times. And it kind of works such that when I was reading German, and I saw the word Tisch, I was like, table, because I kind of had that repetitive association. And if I heard it spoken, I would remember it. But there's a huge downside, is it doesn't work symmetrically. It doesn't work the other way. If you want to say the word table in German, you don't have anything that latches you to that. You just have the Tisch kind of association. So in that case, I highly recommend people consider using mnemonics, because this kind of glues the word to your memory. So for instance, in that example with the German Tisch, I would think to myself, okay, let's imagine a table made out of tissues. So I have a table made out of kitchen roll or whatever it is, and I put a drink on it, and the table collapses, the drink spills everywhere. I have to get all of these tissues, and I have to wipe it up because it's created a huge mess. So what that does is it puts this association in my mind of visualizing a table made out of tissues, so that when I'm speaking German and I want to say table, I can just think for a second, the table was made out of tissues, and I have that association. So you have a link that connects the word you want to the word you want to say to the translation. Now the thing is, you don't need to do this forever, because you only need the association a couple of times, and then the word just becomes a natural part of you. So there's a great website, memrise.com, MEMORISE, and this has people voting up their favorite mnemonics. That's a great system. Another one is, other than mnemonics, I'm a big fan of spaced repetition. So there's an app you can install on your smartphone called Anki, and this presents the words to you in a way that you see them just before you would forget them. And it's another problem with memorizing a big list, is you may see a word that's important to you, but you may not see it again for a very long time, and you may see the simple words over and over again. So when you use a particular system, it shows you the harder words way more frequently and the easier words way less frequently.
I like your ideas of not only mnemonics, but creative mnemonics. For example, with tonal languages, you use the idea of something falling or something rising in your memory tricks. And I'd never thought of doing something like that before. So I think these kinds of ideas are enormously helpful. And actually, in your book, I have read your book, I love your book. There are dozens and dozens more helpful ideas, and I could ask you dozens and dozens more questions, but I want people to actually read your book, so I guess I'll leave off here. And with that, I'd just like to thank you so much for your wonderful and very insightful answers.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you having me on to talk to everybody, giving them some inspiration.
Dr. Robert Bilder directs the Consortium for Neuropsychiatric Phenomics, which is a team of more than 50 investigators, most centered at the University of California.
How to learn languages effectively. The first thing we should do is that speak anything. Speak Mars and speak more. For beginning, is will you will make mistake, but it's okay. You will get better as the time. And the second I will and we need associate with the word, the new vocabulary. And when you call this vocabulary, will easily can have it. The third idea is that by some tip and technique influence overall as repetition can what we have learned when we have learned courses at Coursera. We are analyze them and relax with the happy learning.
In Los Angeles. This consortium aims to understand neuropsychological phenotypes on a genome-wide scale through a combination of human research, basic research, and informatics strategies. Basically, Dr. Bilder is digging to create a fundamentally new understanding of how to look at personality disorders and diseases that have an effect on personality. In this regard, Dr. Bilder also directs and co-directs a slew of other important centers. But of the most interest to us, Dr. Builder is the director of the Tenenbaum Center for the Biology of Creativity, one of the most important programs in the country involved in the study of creativity. So with that, it's a pleasure to speak here with Dr. Robert Builder. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Dr. Builder. You're one of the world's foremost experts on creativity. So I have a question for you. Sometimes my students will tell me, now, wait a minute, other people have solved this problem before. So if I think about it and figure out how to solve this problem, I'm actually not being creative while I'm solving this problem because other people have already solved this problem. What are your thoughts on that situation?
Well, I think until you've solved the problem yourself, you haven't exercised your brain and made the unique connections in your brain that are needed to solve that problem. So we could distinguish between those things that are creative for the world, which that may not be creative with respect to everything else that's been done before. But if we think about what's been done that's unique for you, something new for you, and that has value to you, then that satisfies the criteria for creativity. And it's important for your brain to do that in order to pursue other creative problems.
Well, I couldn't agree more. So I'm glad you made that point. When you're trying to learn something new and you speak publicly, sometimes you, like everyone, is criticized for it. What advice do you have for handling this kind of criticism?
You know, someone told me something that I'm surprised I only heard a few weeks ago. And they said, leadership is the ability to disguise panic. And I think that if I had to think of all the occasions I've had when I had great concerns about what was going on or about handling criticisms, and I think that it may only be through repeated experience that one learns how to cope with that a little bit better. Always difficult, but I think if the only advice I can give to others is to, always adopt the same kind of curiosity about your own shortcomings and your own difficulty getting the big picture and understanding the entire scope of the problem that you would apply to others and to any problem in general.
I like that too, sort of be willing to accept discomfort sometimes because that's necessary.
Some people would say that it's only when you experience some discomfort that you're actually accomplishing some kind of change. So to the extent that one wants to make progress, it's necessarily going to involve some degree of discomfort. That's the nature of change. Physical change in the brain has to involve some work, and that work has to involve some discomfort.
I couldn't agree more.
I'm reminded my old swimming coach used to say, no pain, no gain.
Yes, indeed.
And that may also be true of the brain.
Sometimes those
Coach used to say, no pain, no gain.
Yes, indeed.
And that may also be true of the brain.
Sometimes those old proverbs are really so true. That's why they're proverbs. You've had some very interesting insights regarding creativity and being disagreeable. Could you give our viewers just a little bit of insight about that?
Sure. So it's interesting that when we've studied personality, it turns out that there are various models of personality or temperament or character, but they pretty much all boil down to 5 factors, and these have been very reliably seen over time. And the way that I find easiest to remember those 5 factors is to use the acronym OCEAN, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And now when we've looked at the personality characteristics of people and then tried to relate their personality characteristics to their degree of creative achievement, we find that there are 2 correlations here. One of them is not surprising at all. Openness to new experience is associated with creative achievement. But then we find something that's perhaps not quite as intuitive. There is a correlation also with agreeableness, but that correlation is negative. So it means that people who are less agreeable or more disagreeable tend to show higher creative achievement, And I think that we might consider this to be a facet of nonconformism. Those who tend to challenge the status quo, challenge models, and don't believe things just because other people have said them. I think that these are folks who are more likely to be creative achievers.
I think so too. That's a very interesting, and it's a counterintuitive finding.
Yes, usually people think agreeableness is a nice positive trait, and indeed agreeableness is a nice positive trait. Yet there are occasions when disagreeableness can push the envelope, help us to challenge prior conventions, and make the kinds of pushes forward, that are outside the box.
I think sometimes it's hard to walk that fine line between being agreeable because things make sense, and then sometimes stepping back and being willing to be disagreeable because it doesn't make sense to you. And then sometimes you find out actually it does make sense, but sometimes you're right to be disagreeable. So finding that fine line of where to agree and where to disagree, and being willing to disagree if you think that something is not quite right, I think that's an important line to find.
Yeah, it's difficult to know how to balance the correct approach, and indeed I think that's one of the cornerstones of creativity, just by following from the root definitions of creativity, which typically emphasize, on the one hand, whatever the product is, to be considered creative, it has to be new, but then it also has to be useful or valued by someone. So this involves a kind of a tension between doing something that may be totally driven by your own vision of things and those things that are going to end up being adopted or used by others. So it means that you can create things that may be novel, wonderful, and strange, but if they're too novel, too strange, then they're not going to be considered wonderful by others. So finding this sweet spot in the range between what you find to be the newest and most valuable and exciting and what others believe is, I think that's a lifelong process of deliberation and balance.
That's so true. I think writers in particular, writers and inventors are both, they have to face what other people's opinions of their work are. And sometimes it's just surprising what they'll come back with. Something that you thought was perfect, a real gem, people will come back and give you insights that allow you to understand that maybe your perceptions weren't quite right.
That's right. Yeah, I've gotten that feedback, quite routinely, and I may be a little defensive at first, and then try to warm up to it and try to understand. Well, what did they have in mind?
Any particular tips on how you learn most effectively?
Well, I think people vary a lot in terms of the degree to which they are dominated by words or images. Some verbal versus visual kinds of learning styles. And so I find that I do best if I can go between the two, because I love words and language. I was actually once accused by my students of being a sesquipedalian and got a little plaque from them. And I was embarrassed. I didn't know what sesquipedalian meant until I got the plaque. And then anybody who watches this can look it up. But anyhow, I love words, and so there's a nuance there that I really like. But at the same time, I feel like I don't have a complete understanding unless I've somehow mapped it, graphed it, or visualized it. And so I like to go back and forth between those two kinds of approaches. The other thing that I really like to do, and sometimes we've recommended this in exercises to enhance creativity, is to do a powers of 10 exercise. And for those who haven't seen it, there's a great video. You can easily get it online. You just look up powers of 10 video. I think that will do the job. And it basically starts with an image of a man lying in a hammock, and then the camera zooms 10 feet above, then 100 feet above, then 1,000 feet above, goes by powers of 10 until ultimately you're exploring the cosmos and outer space. And then it zooms back down into and then goes powers of 10 inside the skin, goes into the cell, goes down and reveals the molecules. And then finally, and what's really mind-blowing is how far you have to go when you start getting into subatomic space, where you're really surrounded by nothingness. It seems even more vast than the universe itself. So I think that getting that kind of exercise, getting perspective, trying to figure out what's the higher altitude view, stepping back from a problem and thinking about, oh, well, why am I doing this? What's the bigger picture? But then also drilling into individual facets and details. By zooming in and zooming out from the problem, I usually find I get a much better idea of the problem scope and a different perspective on that problem.
That is very worthwhile. I've never really thought of problem solving in that perspective. I think that's maybe a little bit what you do a bit subconsciously or just naturally when you get away from the problem and you get new perspective when you're just going out for a walk or something like that. But that's an interesting perspective, zooming in and zooming out.
I think the brain probably does some of this spontaneously, and particularly during sleep. Because if you think about what happens during sleep, you've got a washing away of all of the conscious, top-down cognitive control over your thoughts. And it probably permits different neural networks to assemble themselves in ways that may make sense spontaneously, but are free from the guided process of our top-down mind. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why people will awake from sleep, dreams, or other relaxed states when they're not thinking about problems, and all of a sudden have come up with a solution. All the components were there, but it required a release, at least temporarily, of the constraints. That we've been applying to the problem to recognize a new solution. That may be how Auguste Kekulé recognized the benzene ring, from seeing the snake biting its tail.
I think sometimes I like to think of it as an octopus of attention, and it turns off during sleep. And so the tentacles of the octopus can randomly go about, and that's what helps create some of these innovative new ideas.
Well, that's interesting. I think you were reading my mind, because when I was thinking about Auguste Kekulé, who dreamt about a snake biting his tail, I was also thinking, well, what if instead of a snake biting its tail, he'd imagined a spider or it could have been an octopus, then we'd have a completely different structure of organic chemistry before us. We would never have discovered the benzene ring.
Well, there we go. Well, that's what they say. Insights that arise from the subconscious like that they can sometimes be invaluable, but you always got to check them because sometimes they may seem right, but they're not actually right.
That's right, yeah. And there, I'm mindful of, speaking of spiders, the fantastic experiments that were done in the early investigation of LSD, the hallucinogen, where different drugs were given to spiders and see what impact it had on their web-making skills. And while many people felt that they became incredibly creative while under the influence of LSD, and while many people felt they had great insights while they were under the influence of LSD, the spiders, it turns out, made really lousy webs when they were under the influence of LSD. And I think a lot of people who had been putting down what they were thinking about at the time that they were doing LSD found later, when they were no longer under the influence, that the products that they had created were not exactly what they'd hoped.
I think that's true. There's interesting perspectives from history of different people's insights whilst under drugs and not under drugs, and sometimes I think it's actually surprisingly good, but other times it's surprisingly terrible. So there's definitely a mixture there.
This is true. I was just reviewing with a class different kinds of visual representations of dualities or balances between opposing forces. So we were talking about the yin-yang symbol, the Tibetan eternal knot. But one of the symbols that's one of my favorites, probably because I understand it the least, is the intersecting gyres or intersecting cones that were described by Yeats and his wife George. And those images were probably created while they were under the influence of opium.
I will definitely have to go look those up now. So, Dr. Builder, I so appreciate you're an Abecedarian polymath.
Oh boy, now I have something else to look up myself.
So I greatly appreciate your insights here, and on behalf of all the students of Learning How to Learn, I thank you.
Thank you, Barb. It's always great talking to you.
Learning how to learn.
Daphne Braygrant grew up in the newspaper business. Her father owned a struggling weekly paper in Vancouver, Canada. While going to high school and college, she worked there until she graduated and for a few more years. Then she became a senior editor at a large metropolitan daily where she worked for about 8 years. Following that, she became pregnant with triplets and decided she still didn't have nearly enough work. She wanted to be self-employed. So the publication coach was born. Interestingly, Daphne says that she struggled with writer's block during all of her years of newspapering and didn't address the problem until she started her own business. She's also the author of the popular book 8.5 Steps to Writing Faster, Better. Through her website, www.publicationcoach.com, she offers the weekly newsletter Power Writing. It's weekly, brief, and best of all, it's free. I've been a subscriber for years myself, and I encourage you to sign up as well. Meanwhile, it's my great pleasure to welcome Daphne here today. Daphne, you're a professional writing coach. Tell me about your own past struggles with writer's block.
Well, the interesting thing for me is that I struggled enormously with writing, even when I was a professional reporter at a daily newspaper. Now, you might think, how can someone who works at a daily newspaper have writer's block? Didn't you have to write every day? But the thing is, I was a born editor, and when I worked in newspapers, I did a little bit of writing and mostly editing. And I loved editing. I've always loved editing. And the few times when I had to write when I worked for the daily newspaper, I found it very stressful and extremely difficult. Partly, I guess, because I was an editor, and so I was a little bit embarrassed about how slow a writer I was, but also because I hadn't really learned the tricks and techniques I've since learned to make writing faster, easier, and better.
Well, I think we'll be talking about some of those tricks. And one of the ways I think that we might talk about that is just how did you teach your triplets to write? Did you use some of those tricks?
Well, I taught my triplets to do many things. They're 20 years old now, and they're all at university, which is great. They're so different, you'd barely know they were siblings, never mind triplets. I don't know whether it would be fair to say I taught them to write, but I certainly gave them some of the tricks and techniques I give my own clients, and they too have found them very helpful.
Well, let's home in on one of those tricks. I mean, how would you describe the difference between diffuse mode and focus mode when you're thinking about and when it comes to writing?
Yeah, that's a really, really important point, because for me, the diffuse mode, I call that the creative or writing mode. And the focused mode, I call the editing brain. And one of the big mistakes that many people make when they're writing is they try to write with their editing brain. And the metaphor I like to use is I say, imagine that these two different parts of your brain are like two different people, and now put them in a car. What do you know about that? Only one person can drive. So if your critical or focused brain is driving, your diffuse brain is asleep in the back seat. And that's not what anyone wants when they're writing. You want your diffuse brain to be active and awake, to be the one that's driving when you're writing. And so one of the techniques I like to use to help people engage their diffuse brain is mind mapping. Now, the important thing about mind mapping is it's a little bit different from concept mapping. And I don't know too much about concept mapping because I'm not an academic myself. But mind mapping, which is also called clustering, some people may know it by that name instead, is where you take a piece of paper and you turn it sideways. And that's really, really important. Having the paper sideways is essential, because what that does is that kind of liberates your brain. And it says, oh, I can go off in any direction. If you have the paper in the sort of standard 8.5 by 11 way, that's going to make your brain think that you need to write a list, or worse, an outline. And I really encourage students in particular not to outline before writing. And I know this flies in the face of what many grade 10 English teachers will counsel you to do. But the thing is, if you think about it, outlining engages your focused brain. That's the part of the brain that's good at spelling and grammar and alphabetical order and those sort of very specific tasks. And when you're writing, you want to create. You want to think of things. You want to make new connections. And that's where you really need the diffuse brain. So to mind map, take that piece of paper, turn it sideways, and write the topic in the center of the page. Then draw a circle around it. And once you've drawn that circle around it, then just write whatever springs into your brain. The thing I often like to say, and people find this a little bit gross sometimes, but I say it's kind of like vomiting onto the page. So don't criticize yourself. Don't second guess any of those ideas. If it occurs to your brain, then write it down. So I did a mind map some years ago, and I use this when I'm teaching mind mapping all the time. And I did it on the first day of school. I don't mean I wrote the mind map on the first day of school. I wrote the mind map about the first day of school. So what I wrote in the center of the page was first day of school. And part of the reason I picked this topic was because it breaks very neatly into some obvious marking points. So one is grade 1, one is high school, one is university. So you can have different first days of school tied to those events. So then I wrote those down, and you'll see I've marked them with little crosshatches. I did that after the fact, just so that when you look at the mind map, you can see this easily. And then if you look, you'll see next to the one I marked grade 1 in the top right-hand corner, I've written the words bee sting. Now, what does a bee sting have to do with the first day of grade 1? Well, when I went to grade 1, first day of school, I'm standing in the schoolyard with my mother, and I got stung on the lip by a bee. I will never, ever forget that moment. For me, first day of school will always be linked with being stung by a bee right there on the lip. So all I have to write is 2 words, bee sting, and everything comes back to me. I can picture the spot, the exact spot in the playground where I was standing. I can remember the crabby old nun who came up to me and said, "What are you making such a big deal about?" Because I was crying, so it's almost like a movie I can play in my own brain just based on those 2 words. Now, one of the questions I often get when I talk about this is people say, well, I can see how mind mapping would be very useful for fiction, and I could see how it might even be useful for memoir, but what does it have to do with nonfiction? And I have to say that I use mind mapping every day of my writing life, and I have never written any fiction, ever. So I use it entirely for nonfiction. And what you can do is when you interview someone and you take your notes, then you put the notes aside and you do the mind map based on your memory of that interview. And the things that are most interesting, I guarantee your brain will remember. Now, for university students, the issue is going to be a bit different because it's less likely you're going to be interviewing a bunch of people. It's more likely you're going to be reading a bunch of books. But the same principle applies. If there is something that is really interesting to you and important and integral to your research, you're likely to remember that. And the things that are most important are going to float to the top of your memory. So you will remember them, and then you can mind map about them.
Well, this is very interesting because it's related to the techniques that brilliant Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist Santiago Ramon y Cajal used when he was trying to really understand what was going on at an anatomical level. He would look very carefully at the cells he was watching in his microscope, and then he would turn and he would try to draw them. And he would draw and redraw until he had abstracted the key chunks that stuck in his memory from when he was looking at them with the camera, with the microscope, versus when he was trying to draw them on the page. So in some sense, it seems what you're doing is to try and abstract the key ideas that have somehow crystallized in your mind through using the mind mapping technique.
That's a really, really good way of putting it. Yeah, and it interests me in terms of education these days. I think we are downplaying a bit the value of memory. And, I don't know about you, but I have all my phone numbers entered into my iPhone. I don't remember a phone number anymore to save my life. And people don't memorize poetry anymore. And, there's all sorts of things that used to be part of the regular day-to-day life and regular schooling life that aren't there so much anymore. And so I think we're a little bit wary of forcing ourselves to rely on our memory at all. But the thing that strikes me about mind mapping is that if something is interesting or important to you, you're going to remember it. At least you're going to remember it well enough to mind map it. And then, of course, when you get to the point where you have to do citations, of course you have to look it up. You have to get that 100% right, or you're, quoting someone else, you need to check it word for word. But for doing the mind map, for inspiring yourself to write, you're not needing that kind of 100% accuracy. You're just needing the inspiration. And that's what mind mapping is so valuable for.
I couldn't agree more, and I also couldn't agree more about the importance of memory. I think what we've done is mistakenly by thinking, well, memorization can be sometimes a bad thing if you're just sitting there memorizing things without understanding them. But we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. We've said memorization is always bad, and that's actually not true. I mean, great poets have said, memorize a poem because it helps you to understand the underlying meaning much more deeply. And in the same way, when you memorize, for example, an equation, it can help you understand that poetic undertone that underlies the equation, and that's often lost. But I have to bring out another, something you've alluded to in the past, and that's simply the idea of when you're trying to get into that diffuse mode, and I'm saying this a little bit metaphorically because we haven't truly analyzed what's going on, but that mode where you're stepping back a little bit and you're not focusing completely and intently, and you're trying to get something down on a page that sometimes, in order to avoid that editorial mode, the best thing to do is to cover up your screen with a towel or something like that, and that helps prevent you from going back and trying to edit what you just wrote and just get it out onto the page.
Oh, absolutely. That is the number one mistake that most students and, not even, you don't have to be a student to make this mistake. Most beginning writers make is they edit while they write. And I like to say that that's kind of like trying to clear the table while you're still eating dinner. It just doesn't work very well. And one of the tricks I suggest to people if they've developed this habit is that they turn off their monitor while they're writing. So of course you need to be a touch typist to be able to do that. But if you are a touch typist, then turn off your monitor. And if that feels too drastic, or if you have a Mac that doesn't let you turn off your monitor separately, then just hang a towel over it and write without looking at what you're reading. So, I wrote for probably 40 years while I edited constantly while I wrote, and that was so dysfunctional and so bad for me, and it slowed me down so much and made writing so difficult and traumatic that I finally made the decision that I had to break that habit. And so I started turning off my monitor. I tried some other things as well that also really helped. There's a great app on the internet called Write or Die. So it's writeordie.com. And if you scroll down that screen a little bit, then you'll get to an area where you can enter the number of words you want to write and enter a time limit for yourself. And then you press a button that says, I can't remember what it says, but something like start. And then you get a blank screen and you start to write. And what inevitably happens is we'll write a few words and then we stop and we look off and stare into space while we're trying to plan what to write next. And what happens is the software notices we're not typing, and after X number of seconds, I think it's about 10 seconds, of not moving the keyboard at all, then the screen starts to pinken. And I like to compare it to a blush because the screen's embarrassed for you. And it gets pinker and pinker and pinker the longer you go without writing. And I haven't timed this in a long time, so I can't remember exactly the time limit it gives you. Let's say it's 20 seconds. If you've gone 20 seconds without writing at all, then you get a loud, punishing noise. So it's either a crying baby, a car alarm, or 70s disco music. I'll leave it to you to decide which is worse. But it's a very clever technique for teaching you to break the habit of editing while you write.
I've used Write or Die myself, and I think it does work very, very well. I love this approach of separating your editing from your actual writing. For me, what I sometimes find is when I'll think of something and I'm about to put it down, and then I think, oh, that's terrible. I can't write that. And then I'm editing in my head before I'm writing. And when I stop that, when I just say, okay, I got to get that out. Hey, that's terrible, but that's the way it is. It's going to come out on the page terrible. I'm so surprised later when I look back and I find, hey, you know what? That actually wasn't as terrible as I thought. In fact, it got me started, and it's pretty good.
Yes, that happens to so many people. And you know, I have to tell you, I've taught writing for so many years now. I can tell you that when I talk to people about that nasty little editing voice that's in the back of all our brains, we all have that voice, and it says the same thing to all of us. It says things like, this is no good. My boss or teacher is going to hate this. This is boring. This is really, really bad. That voice says really negative, essentially unhelpful things to all of us. We're all in the same boat. So what I like to do is I like to talk back to that voice, and I say things like, could you shut up for a minute? I don't have time to talk right now. I will talk to you when I'm editing, but I'm writing right now. I'm too busy. And if you can be conscious of that voice and talk back to it rather than just let it yammer in your ear, then you're better off. So I think the number one technique for dealing with that is just recognizing that it's happening, recognizing that it happens to everyone, and taking some steps to deal with it.
Well, I thank you so much, Daphne. This was very useful and a fantastic reminder even for me. I want to encourage everyone out there to please go ahead and explore signing up for for Daphne's free newsletter, which is at www.publicationcoach.com. I'm a subscriber as well. And maybe even take a look at her great book, 8.5 Steps to Writing Faster, Better, or Daphne's email course, which is called Extreme Writing Makeover. So thank you so much again, Daphne, and we'll see you on the flip side.
Thanks, Barb. Nice talking to you.